Welcome. Today, we're going to talk about something that most of us feel but struggle to articulate, that nagging sense that something fundamental doesn't add up in American democracy. You vote, you follow the news, you care about issues, and yet somehow nothing seems to change in the ways that matter most to your daily life. This isn't a podcast about being cynical or giving up. It's about understanding, because you cannot protect what you don't understand. Can you name the three branches of government? Of course you can. Executive, legislative, judicial. Maybe you even memorized how a bill becomes a law. Now let me ask you some different questions. Who sets the curriculum that determines what your children learn in school? Who decides which crimes get prosecuted in your community and which ones don't? Who determines whether the potholes on your street get fixed? Who wrote the terms and conditions you agreed to when you signed up for your phone plan? And who decides whether those terms are actually enforceable? The answers to these questions are school board members, district attorneys, city council members, public works directors, corporate lawyers, and under-resourced regulatory agencies. These are the people and positions shaping your daily life in ways that feel immediate and real, yet they rarely appear in civics textbooks. This gap isn't an accident. It's a feature of how power prefers to operate, quietly, out of view, while attention focuses elsewhere. Here's the story most Americans were taught about how democracy works. Citizens identify problems and preferences. Citizens vote for representatives who share those preferences. Representatives pass laws reflecting what citizens want. The executive branch implements those laws. Courts ensure laws align with the Constitution. And if citizens are unhappy, they vote for different representatives. It's a tidy, closed loop where power flows from citizens through elections to policy outcomes and back again. But here's what that version leaves out. Who decides what issues citizens hear about and how they hear about them? Who determines which candidates appear on the ballot and which ideas those candidates are allowed to express? Who writes the actual text of legislation before representatives vote on it? Who decides how aggressively or loosely laws are enforced? Who appoints the judges and based on what criteria? And what happens when the formal process produces outcomes that powerful interests don't want? These questions point toward a different understanding of power, one that's far more accurate but far less reassuring. Power is not the same as authority, though the two are constantly confused. Authority is the formal right to make decisions. The president has the authority to sign or veto bills. A judge has the authority to rule on cases. A city council has the authority to pass ordinances. That's all written in law. Power is different. Power is the ability to shape outcomes, to determine what gets decided, who gets to decide, what options are available, and how people think about problems in the first place. Authority is written in law. Power is exercised in practice. Sometimes the person with authority also has power, but often power operates through people and structures that never appear on an organizational chart. Let me give you a concrete example. Your local school board has the authority to choose textbooks. That's written in state education law. But who decides which textbooks are even available to choose from? Publishing companies. Who influences what's in those textbooks? State adoption committees in large states like Texas and California, because publishers create books for the biggest markets. Who shapes what those state committees want? Advocacy groups, think tanks, and political movements with long-term strategic visions. By the time your local school board sits down to choose textbooks, most of the meaningful choices have already been made by actors who never face voters and whose names most parents will never know. The school board has authority, but power operates elsewhere. To understand how power actually works, we need to distinguish between four different types. First, there's formal power. This is the power most people recognize, the power that comes from holding official positions. The president can veto legislation. Congress can pass laws. Governors can issue executive orders. Formal power is visible, documented, and usually comes with clear rules about its limits. This is the power civics class teaches. Second, there's informal power. This is the power that comes from access, relationships, money, and influence. A billionaire who can fund or destroy political careers wields enormous informal power despite holding no official position. A lobbyist who drafts legislation and provides research to understaffed legislative offices exercises informal power. A media mogul who decides which stories get covered and how they're framed has informal power. Informal power is less visible, but often more consequential than formal power. Third, there's structural power. This is the power embedded in systems themselves, the way institutions are designed, the rules that govern them, and the defaults they establish. Structural power is why changing individual politicians often doesn't change outcomes. The structure itself channels behavior in predictable directions. Gerrymandered districts are structural power. The Electoral College is structural power. The filibuster is structural power. Campaign finance laws that allow unlimited spending are structural power. These structures shape what's possible before any individual decision maker enters the picture. And fourth, there's cultural power. This is the power to define what's normal, what's extreme, what's possible, and what's unthinkable. Cultural power shapes how people understand problems and what solutions they can imagine. It operates through media, education, religion, tradition, and shared narratives. Cultural power is why some ideas that enjoy majority support, like universal health care or serious climate action, can be dismissed as unrealistic, while ideas with minority support, like tax cuts for billionaires or corporate subsidies, get treated as common sense. Now here's the crucial insight. Power works best when people don't see it working, and there are several specific reasons why power remains largely invisible to most Americans. First, attention is deliberately directed elsewhere. National political theater dominates everything: presidential tweets, partisan warfare, cable news outrage. Meanwhile, consequential decisions happen quietly at local and state levels, in regulatory agencies, in court chambers, and in negotiations the public never sees. Those who hold power benefit when public attention focuses on spectacle rather than substance, on personalities rather than structures, on dramatic conflicts rather than quiet deal-making. Second, complexity creates obscurity. The American political system is genuinely complex. Layers of federalism, separation of powers, bureaucratic procedures, legal technicalities. This complexity serves multiple functions, one of which is to make it difficult for non-experts to understand how decisions actually get made. When a bill fails, is it because of one senator's opposition, a filibuster, a parliamentary procedure, a committee chair's decision not to schedule a vote, or lobbying pressure that prevented the bill from ever being considered seriously? Usually, it's several of these factors working together. The complexity makes accountability nearly impossible. Third, power operates preventatively. The most effective use of power is to prevent issues from ever reaching the decision-making stage. This is power at its most invisible. The topics that never become political issues, the alternatives never seriously considered, the questions never asked. Why isn't public campaign financing a mainstream political issue despite widespread dissatisfaction with money in politics? Why do major policy decisions get made during government shutdowns or buried in inappropriate bills? These are questions about power preventing certain possibilities from being considered. Fourth, ideology masks interest. Those with power rarely present their interests as such. Instead, they frame their preferences in terms of universal values: freedom, security, prosperity, tradition, innovation, common sense. A corporation fighting environmental regulation doesn't say we want to increase profits by externalizing costs. It says we want to protect jobs and economic growth. A wealthy individual opposing progressive taxation doesn't say, I want to keep more money. They say we need to preserve economic incentives and reward success. This ideological framing makes it harder to see whose interests are actually being served. And fifth, success is attributed to individuals, while failure is attributed to systems. When things go right, individuals get credit. When things go wrong, we often blame individuals too: corrupt politicians, bad voters, foreign interference. This focus on individuals obscures the systems that enable or constrain individual action. A well-intentioned representative with good policy ideas still needs campaign money, must navigate committee structures, faces pressure from party leadership, operates within media narratives, and is constrained by procedural rules. The system shapes outcomes more than individual virtue. So here's a more useful way to think about power. Power is the ability to do 5 specific things. 1. Decide what gets decided. The power to set agendas, to determine which issues receive attention and resources, is more important than the power to decide any particular issue. A city council that never discusses affordable housing policy is exercising power through omission. A Congress that debates tax cuts but not wealth inequality is shaping outcomes by controlling what gets debated. 2. Control who gets to decide. Who sits at the table when decisions are made? Who gets to vote? Who can run for office? Who can afford to lobby? Who is quoted in news stories as an expert? These gatekeeping functions are exercises of power that occur before any formal decision-making. 3. Determine what options are available. Before any vote happens, choices are narrowed. Power determines which options appear on the menu. By the time citizens vote on ballot measures or legislators vote on bills, the range of possibilities has usually been restricted to options acceptable to powerful interests. 4. Shape how people think about problems. The power to frame issues, to define problems and what counts as a reasonable solution, is foundational. Is climate change an environmental crisis requiring systemic change, or an economic opportunity for green technology? Is poverty a policy failure requiring redistribution, or an individual failure requiring better work ethic? How problems are framed determines what solutions are imaginable. And 5, punish or reward based on compliance. Power includes the ability to impose costs on those who resist and provide benefits to those who cooperate. This doesn't require formal authority. A corporation can reward compliant politicians with campaign contributions and punish opponents with attack ads. A media outlet can provide favorable coverage to some sources and ignore others. Social movements can make certain positions politically toxic. It's easier to be angry at a particular senator who voted wrong than to understand the campaign finance system that shapes how all senators behave. It's easier to blame low-information voters than to examine how information itself is structured and distributed. But this individual focus has real costs. First, it obscures patterns. When the same outcomes keep happening regardless of which individuals are in power, the problem is systemic, not individual. Second, it makes change seem simpler than it is. If the problem is bad individuals, the solution is to elect better ones. But if the problem is structural, changing individuals without changing structures produces minimal change. Third, it protects power. When attention focuses on individual villains, the systems that enable and reward that villainy remain unexamined and intact. And fourth, it breeds cynicism. When people blame individuals, get those individuals removed, and see nothing change, they often conclude that change is impossible, rather than that they misdiagnosed the problem. None of this means individuals don't matter or that individual corruption isn't real. It means individual behavior is shaped by systems, incentives, and structures. Understanding power requires understanding those systems. Now, power benefits from confusion about how it operates. When people don't understand who makes decisions, how they make them, and how to influence decision makers, things happen. First, accountability becomes impossible. If you don't know who decided something or how they decided it, you can't hold anyone accountable. This is why crucial decisions often get made through complex procedures in obscure venues. Difficulty tracing responsibility is a feature, not a bug. Second, resistance becomes scattered. When people can't identify the actual locus of power, their efforts to create change dissipate. They protest at City Hall when the decision was made at the state level. They call their representatives when the decision was made by an unelected agency. They vote in elections when the outcome was determined by structural rules before voting began. Third, cynicism replaces engagement. When efforts to create change consistently fail because they target the wrong place or use the wrong tactics, people often give up rather than refine their analysis. Nothing ever changes becomes the conclusion, rather than, I was pushing on the wrong lever. Fourth, expertise becomes gatekeeping. When the system is deliberately made complex, understanding it can require significant time, education, and resources. This allows those who benefit from current arrangements to dismiss critics as not understanding how things really work. Complexity becomes a form of gatekeeping that protects insiders. And fifth, reform gets misdirected. Well-intentioned reform efforts that don't understand how power operates make changes that sound good but accomplish little. Ethics rules that don't address the revolving door. Campaign finance reform that leaves dark money untouched. Voting rights legislation that doesn't address gerrymandering. These reforms may be sincere but ineffective because they don't target actual power. So what does it mean to see power clearly? It requires several things. It requires asking who benefits when policies don't match public preferences. It requires following money, access, and relationships, rather than just formal authority. It requires paying attention to what doesn't get discussed as much as what does. It requires noticing patterns across different issues and different officials. It requires distinguishing between how systems are supposed to work, the civics class version, and how they actually work, observable reality. And it requires taking seriously your own experience of powerlessness as information about how power operates. Here's something important. Most Americans have accurate intuitions about power based on their lived experience. You know something is off. You sense that voting alone isn't enough. You recognize that money matters more than it should. You observe that outcomes don't match what majorities want. What's often missing is not the intuition, but the framework, a way to organize those accurate observations into a coherent understanding of how power actually works. Let me be clear about what moment in history we're in. Americans in 2026 face a particular set of circumstances. The second Trump administration is reshaping federal power. The Supreme Court has issued decisions that expand presidential authority while restricting regulatory agencies. State legislatures are diverging dramatically, some expanding rights while others systematically restrict them. Political violence and intimidation have become normalized in ways unthinkable a decade ago. The information ecosystem is polluted with content designed to confuse rather than inform. Meanwhile, many structural problems that have existed for decades remain unaddressed. The Electoral College can still deliver presidents who lose the popular vote. Gerrymandering still allows parties to choose their voters instead of the other way around. Money still dominates politics in ways that mock the idea of equal representation. Courts packed with lifetime appointees make policy decisions that no elected legislature could pass. The disconnect between what Americans were taught democracy means and what they experience daily has never been wider. This is not because the system is broken. In many ways, it's functioning exactly as it was engineered to function by those who hold power. Now, voting matters. It's essential, but it is not sufficient. Voting is one tool in a much larger system of political influence. Treating it as the only meaningful form of participation does two dangerous things at once. It overpromises what elections can realistically accomplish, and it hides the many other ways power is exercised every day. When voting is framed as the beginning and the end of civic responsibility, people are set up for disillusionment. When change doesn't come, they're told to blame themselves, their neighbors, or the other side, rather than the structures that shape outcomes long before ballots are cast. Consider what happened after the 2020 election. Record turnout, clear results, and yet for millions of Americans, little changed in their daily lives. Healthcare remained expensive, wages stayed stagnant, housing costs kept rising, student debt persisted, climate policy stalled. Why? Because voting, while necessary, is only one moment in a continuous process of power negotiation. The 2024 election brought another wave of promises and another round of disillusionment for those who believed voting alone would solve systemic problems. Democrats found their policy priorities blocked or watered down. Republicans found themselves governed by the same elite networks they thought they were rejecting. This pattern repeats because the story Americans tell themselves about democracy is incomplete. Understanding that story, understanding power, means understanding several specific things. It means understanding why local and state governments matter more than most people realize, and how district maps shape outcomes before votes are cast. It means understanding how unelected officials and agencies influence daily life more than Congress, and how courts have become one of the most powerful political tools, how legal structures and cultural narratives reinforce one another. And it means understanding how money doesn't just influence politics, it structures what's possible. There's a reason civics education focuses on how a bill becomes a law rather than how a corporate lobbyist writes the bill before any legislator sees it. There's a reason you learned about the three branches of government, but not about which unelected officials actually make most consequential decisions. There's a reason you were taught that voting is your primary civic duty, but not how to organize sustained pressure campaigns or testify at local government hearings. Power benefits from confusion. When people don't understand how decisions are made, who makes them, and how to influence those decision makers, they become easier to manage, placate, or ignore. The gap in understanding serves a function. It preserves existing power arrangements by making them seem either inevitable, that's just how things are, or incomprehensible. It's too complicated for regular people to understand. But how power works in America is neither inevitable nor incomprehensible. It is the result of specific choices made by specific people, often with a specific interests in mind. And what has been constructed by human choices can be understood and changed through human action. Power thrives on confusion, distraction, and isolation. It weakens when people understand how it operates and begin acting with intention instead of reaction. You do not need to become a politician to participate meaningfully in democracy. You do not need to dedicate your life to activism. You do not need to agree with everyone else. You do not need to be fearless, tireless, or selfless. But you do need to understand the system you are living inside, because you cannot change what you are discouraged from seeing. You cannot protect a democracy you don't understand. And you cannot effectively challenge a power that appears mysterious or overwhelming. Once you understand that power is not magic, that it operates according to understandable patterns, responds to pressure at identifiable points, and can be countered with strategy, it becomes possible to act effectively rather than just expressively. Change is hard, takes longer than it should, and requires more than most people realize. But it's possible, it's happening, and you can be part of it. This is what might be called realistic hope, grounded in how things actually work, not how we wish they worked, but still oriented toward the possibility of change through strategic collective action. The story you were taught about American democracy is incomplete. Understanding power means telling a more complete story, one that might be harder to hear but is more useful to know. Because in 2026, democracy in America needs more than people who believe in it. It needs people who understand it well enough to defend it, repair it, and transform it into something closer to its stated ideals. You cannot protect what you don't understand. The first act of challenging power is understanding power, seeing it clearly, identifying where it actually resides, and recognizing how it actually operates. This is an invitation to look more closely at the system you're living in and to understand power as something constructed by people, not something mystical or inchangeable, and to discover that participation, when informed and collective, is far more powerful than you've been led to believe. An invitation to move from confused frustration to strategic action, and to see yourself not as a helpless subject of impersonal forces, but as one of millions of people who can, and throughout history have, changed systems that seemed unchangeable. The gap between what you were taught and what you experience daily is real. Your intuition that something doesn't add up is correct. And understanding why, understanding how power actually works, is the first step toward doing something about it. Thanks for listening. This is Gravel and Ink. If you would like to dive deeper into any of the topics discussed here, please visit our website